There's a kind of silence that follows rejection, not the quiet kind, the loud kind, the kind that fills up a room and sits on your chest and makes you wonder if you ever had a right to want what you wanted in the first place. She knew that silence well. She had heard it in the hallway outside the principal's office when she was 16. She had heard it in her mother's kitchen when the letter came back unopened. She had heard it in the voice of the admissions officer who said, without cruelty, without malice, without even the dignity of hesitation, we cannot accommodate your application at this time. That sentence. That one sentence. It was supposed to be the end of her story. But there's something that powerful institutions forget when they stamp denied across someone's dreams and slide the file into a cabinet and close the drawer. They forget that some people were not built to stay in drawers. And they forget that sometimes the person who opens that drawer back up is a man who spent 30 years watching soldiers fight wars they didn't understand for countries that didn't always deserve them, and who learned somewhere between the sand and the blood and the long ride home that the greatest waste is not a bullet. It's a human being who never got the chance to become what they were supposed to be. This is a true story. It is not a story about a miracle. Miracles are easy. They don't cost anything. They don't require someone to look at a system and say out loud in front of people with power, this is wrong, and I'm going to fix it. This is a story about that moment. That choice. That phone call that nobody made and the one man who finally did. Her name was Amara, and the file they closed on her future was thick with evidence of everything she had overcome and everything the system had decided didn't matter. The general's name is not important yet. What is important is that he read the file, and he didn't close it. Amara Osei was born in a city that ate ambition for breakfast and asked for seconds. Akha Gena. The kind of place where the morning comes at you fast and loud, where the air smells like diesel and fried plantain, and the particular desperation of people who are trying very hard not to be left behind. Her father drove a taxi 6 days a week and rested on Sundays only because her mother made him. Her mother sold fabric from stall in the Makola market, the kind of selling that requires a specific intelligence. Knowing what a person wants before they know it themselves, reading the hesitation in someone's eyes, understanding the economics of pride. She could look at a woman and know what she could afford and what she wished she could afford, and she would show her both, and she would make the woman feel good about whatever she chose. Amara learned to read people from her mother. She learned to keep going from her father. These two things would matter more than she understood. Later. Much later. When keeping going looked less like a virtue and more like stubbornness, and when reading people was the only tool she had left. She was the second of 4 children. Not the oldest, so she didn't carry the weight of being the example. Not the youngest, so she didn't have the comfort of being protected. She was in the middle, which meant she learned early that if she wanted something, she was going to have to want it louder than everyone else in the room, and then she was going to have to go get it herself. Her older brother Kofi was brilliant in the way that made adults smug. He confirmed everything they already believed about what a smart boy looked like. Her younger siblings were still small enough to be charming. But Amara was in that particular no man's land of middle childhood where you're old enough to be expected to contribute and young enough to be told you don't understand. She understood more than anyone gave her credit for. She understood, for instance, that the school she attended was not the same quality as the school 3 neighborhoods over. She could see it in the textbooks that were missing pages and the chalkboard with the crack down the middle and the teacher who arrived tired every single morning and left tired every single afternoon. She didn't blame the teacher. She understood the teacher was tired because the teacher was also not being paid what she was worth, and the system that underpaid the teacher was the same system that gave Amara the cracked chalkboard. It was all connected. She was 12 years old when she figured this out. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, but she felt it the way you feel something wrong in the structure of a building before anyone else notices the crack. She loved mathematics, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. There was no room in mathematics for someone else's opinion of you. 2 plus 2 was for whether the person grading your paper liked you or not. She found a kind of safety in that, a refuge. She would work problems in the margins of her notebooks and in the dust on the floor of the market stall when her mother needed help, and in her head at night when the house was too hot to sleep and everyone else had given up on the day. By the time she was 15, she had outpaced everything her school could offer her in mathematics and science. Her teacher, Mrs. Boateng, was a tired woman who had seen many students and burned through a significant portion of her hope over 30 years in underfunded classrooms, but she still had enough left to recognize what she was looking at. She wrote a letter. She made phone calls. She applied on Amara's behalf to a scholarship program run by an international education foundation that sent promising students from developing nations to complete secondary school in the United Kingdom. The application took 4 months to prepare. Mrs. Boateng did most of it on her own time. Amara didn't know the full weight of what was happening. She knew it was important. She knew it meant something. She sat through the interviews and answered the questions with the directness that made adults either love her or find her slightly alarming. And when she left the room, she went back to the market and helped her mother sell fabric and didn't let herself think about it too hard because she had learned early that wanting something too much had a way of making the loss of it unbearable. The scholarship came through. She was 16 years old when she landed in Bristol on a gray October morning that smelled like rain and car exhaust and something she would later identify as chip fat from the takeaway near the school. She was wearing a yellow dress because her mother had packed it for her and said it was the color of someone who was going somewhere. She was cold within 10 minutes of leaving the airport. She didn't say so. She would not say so for the entire first winter. The school was called Harrington Collegiate Academy, and it was the kind of institution that had been producing young people who went on to important things for over 150 years. The buildings were old in a way that was meant to impress you. The rules were extensive. The culture was one of easy confidence, the specific confidence of people who had been told their whole lives that places like this were built for them. Amara looked at those buildings on the first day and thought with complete clarity, I'm going to learn everything this place knows. Not because she felt she belonged. She didn't, not yet, not in the way the other students belonged, the ones who had siblings who had attended and parents who knew the headmaster's first name. She belonged in the way that a person belongs to a goal. She was there for a reason. She had work to do. The first year was hard in the ways she had expected and hard in ways she hadn't. The academics were difficult, but manageable. She was behind in some areas because of the gaps in her earlier schooling, but she worked at a pace that concerned her teachers in the way that a very bright student being pushed to her limits concerns people who are responsible for her well-being. She slept less than she should have. She ate in the library more often than in the dining hall, because the dining hall required a kind of social navigation she didn't have bandwidth for when she was also trying to close 2 years of curriculum gaps in mathematics and learn how British people communicated indirectly about things that made them uncomfortable. She had a roommate named Sophie who was from Kent and who was kind in a careful, uncertain way, the way people are kind when they're not sure of the rules around the person they're being kind to. Sophie left chocolate on Amara's desk during exam season without ever mentioning it. Amara never mentioned it either, but she ate it. It was a friendship conducted almost entirely in gestures, and it was real, and it mattered. By her second year, Amara was not catching up anymore. She was ahead. Her physics teacher, a skeptical Scotsman named Mr. Harding, who had been teaching for 22 years and had given exactly 3 students in that time a perfect score on the internal assessment, gave Amara a perfect score on the internal assessment, and then spent a week acting mildly unsettled about it before coming back to his normal self. Her mathematics results were, according to her year group coordinator, in the top 0.5% of all students nationally. She wanted to study aerospace engineering. This was not a vague wish. This was a plan. She had researched the universities. She had researched the programs. She had researched the scholarships available for international students from sub-Saharan Africa pursuing STEM degrees at Russell Group institutions, and she had cross-referenced those with her projected A-level results, and she had created, in a notebook she kept locked in the box under her bed, a 5-year roadmap written in her small, precise handwriting that detailed every step between where she was and where she intended to be. The notebook had a name on the cover. She had written it there on the day she arrived at Harrington because she thought it would be motivating, and she was right. The name on the cover was the University of Manchester Department of Mechanical, Aerospace, and Civil Engineering. She did not tell many people about the notebook. She told Sophie. She told Mrs. Boateng in a letter home. She did not tell her parents because she did not want to put hope into the air before she knew if the ground was solid enough to hold it. In the spring of her final year, she submitted her application. Her personal statement was, according to the careers counselor at Harrington, the best she had read in 11 years of reviewing applications. Her predicted grades were exceptional. Her references from Mr. Harding and 2 other teachers were the kind of references that departments keep and read again later, the kind with specific detail and restrained urgency that means more than generic praise. She waited. The waiting was its own kind of education. She learned, in those weeks, what it feels like to have done everything correctly and to still not know if it matters. She learned the particular humility of having worked harder than almost anyone around you and still being subject to a process that doesn't care about effort, only outcomes. She read the notebook under her bed on the nights when the waiting got too loud. She ate the chocolate Sophie left on her desk. She did her revision and showed up to her classes and did not let the fear show on her face because showing it would make it more real. The letter came by email. It was 4 sentences long. The first sentence thanked her for her application. The second sentence acknowledged the strength of her academic record. The third sentence said that after careful review, the admissions committee was unable to offer her a place in the current intake. The fourth sentence wished her well in her future endeavors. She read it 3 times. She closed the laptop. She sat on the edge of her bed in the room she shared with Sophie, and she looked at the wall, and she did not cry. Not because she wasn't devastated. She was devastated in the complete, hollow way that you are when something you have built your entire plan around removes itself from the plan without explanation. She didn't cry because crying felt like an acknowledgement that it was over, and she was not ready to acknowledge that it was over. She wrote to the admissions office asking for feedback. The reply, when it came, was 2 sentences. It cited admissions competition and the volume of qualified applicants. It did not mention her specifically. It could have been sent to anyone. She asked her careers counselor. The counselor made calls. The calls went nowhere. The feedback from the department was that her application had been strong, but the intake was competitive, and they encouraged her to reapply the following year. Reapply the following year. She turned those words over in her mind. She was not a British student with a gap year planned and a family home to return to. Her scholarship covered her schooling. Her schooling was done. There was no mechanism for her to remain in the country without enrollment. She could not reapply next year from Bristol because next year in Bristol was not an option available to her. She would have to go home. She sat with that fact for 3 days. And then she packed her things. And she thanked Sophie and Mr. Harding and the new Mrs., her favorite teacher at Harrington, whose name she would carry in her memory for years. And she went to the airport. She wore the yellow dress her mother had packed for her. She did not feel like someone going somewhere. She felt like someone the system had finished with. She was wrong about that. But she didn't know it yet. She didn't know that a man she had never met had recently been sent by a charitable organization he chaired a report on scholarship students who had demonstrated exceptional academic achievement, but failed to secure university placement due to structural barriers. She didn't know that her file was in that report. She didn't know that this man read every page of every file before he formed an opinion, because that was how he had operated for 30 years in environments where bad information got people killed. She didn't know that he had put a paperclip on her page, that he had underlined something, that he had written in the margin 2 words. Call her. General William Adeyemi Osabansu had spent 31 years in the British Army and had learned in that time that institutions lie. Not always with malice. Sometimes with paperwork. Sometimes with policies written by people who never had to look into the face of the individual the policy was failing. He had seen it in the military and he had seen in government, and he had seen in every well-funded organization that spent more energy maintaining its own processes than questioning whether those processes were serving the purpose they were supposed to serve. He was 62 years old. He had retired from active service 4 years earlier with the kind of career that generates a modest Wikipedia page and a longer list of people who would take a phone call from him. He did not use either carelessly. He had a saying, which he had borrowed from a sergeant he served under in his first posting and never returned, about the difference between power and responsibility. Power is having the call. Responsibility is knowing when to make it. He was now the chair of the Commonwealth Education Access Initiative, a foundation he had helped to build after retirement, because 31 years of watching young people from former colonies fight for countries that would not offer their children an equal education had compounded into something he could no longer carry quietly. The foundation identified high-achieving students from Commonwealth nations whose academic trajectories have been interrupted by systemic failure, inadequate funding, visa complications, scholarship gaps, institutional bias in admissions, and it tried to build bridges where the system had burned them. He was not a sentimental man. His wife Margaret would tell you this directly and with affection. He was practical in the specific way that people who have operated in high-stakes environments are practical. He valued precision. He did not waste energy on grievance when action was available, and he had a low tolerance for the performance of concern without the accompaniment of actual effort. He received the quarterly reports on scholarship recipients who had fallen through the gaps, and he read them the way he had read intelligence briefings, for the detail that didn't seem important until it was. He was looking for the student who had done everything right. The ones who had failed because they were lazy or unserious were not his problem. Not because he didn't care, but because the foundation's resources were not infinite, and he had learned that the most leveraged intervention is the one aimed at someone who will run the moment you open the door. Amara's file was not the thickest in the report. It was not accompanied by the kind of supplementary documentation that some of the foundation's partner schools sent. Detailed teacher portfolios, video interviews, the full weight of institutional advocacy. What she had was her transcript, her personal statement, the 2 references, and a 1-page note from her careers counselor at Harrington that said, simply and without embellishment, that in 11 years she had not seen a student of this caliber fail to secure a university place, and that she believed the rejection was a structural and procedural failure, not a reflection of the student's merit or potential. The general read that note first. Then he read the personal statement. Then he went back and read the transcript. Then he did something he did not often do with prospective beneficiaries. He read the personal statement again. There was a section in it about why she wanted to study aerospace engineering. Most students, when answering this question, talked about themselves, their passion, their dream, their childhood fascination with planes or stars or machines. Amara had written about the land, about what it meant for a country to have the ability to monitor its own territory from the air, to track weather systems, to support agricultural planning, to maintain sovereignty over information that richer nations had always controlled on behalf of poorer ones. She had written about data, about the satellites that most of the world's climate research depended on, and about who built them, and about what it would mean for countries like Ghana, for their farmers, their planners, their governments, if there were engineers from those countries with the knowledge to design and operate that kind of technology. She wasn't writing about herself. She was writing about a problem and presenting herself as a potential component of the solution. He put the paperclip on her page. He underlined the paragraph about agricultural data and satellite monitoring. He wrote "call her" in the margin. His assistant, a young woman named Priya who had worked for him for 3 years and had learned to move fast when he used that particular tone, located a contact number within 48 hours. By that point, Amara had been back in Accra for 6 weeks. She was working in the fabric stall with her mother because there was nothing else immediately available, and because standing still felt worse than moving, even if the movement was circular. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Amara almost didn't answer. The number was international, British prefix, and She had received enough polite, dead-end calls from British institutions over the past 2 months that she had developed a specific kind of tiredness at the sight of that prefix. She answered because her mother was watching, and she didn't want to explain why she was ignoring a call. A man's voice. Calm. The accent of someone who had spent decades in institutions where how you sounded mattered, but still carrying something underneath that she couldn't quite place. He introduced himself by his foundation's name first, then his own. She knew the name, not from the military. She didn't follow military careers. She knew it from a profile she had read 2 years earlier in a magazine she'd found in the Harrington Common Room. A piece about Commonwealth education reform, about a retired general who was spending his post-service years trying to fix a system he'd spent his career watching fail the people it was supposed to serve. She had read the profile and thought someone like that exists, and then put the magazine down and gone back to her revision. She gripped the phone. He told her he had read her file. He told her he had a question. The question was, did she still want to study aerospace engineering? She said yes. One word. She didn't elaborate. Something in the steadiness of his voice told her that elaborate was not what was needed here. He said good. Then he asked her about the agricultural satellite paragraph in her personal statement and whether that was genuine thinking or application rhetoric. She told him it was genuine. She told him where the thinking had come from, a documentary she had watched at 14 about the 2010 drought in the Sahel, and the gap between what satellite imaging could have predicted and what the affected countries actually had access to in terms of early warning data. She had watched that documentary and understood with the mathematical part of her brain that the problem was partly an engineering problem, a capacity problem. She had known then what to call the field. She found out later. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who has stopped paying attention, the quiet of someone who is thinking precisely. He told her he was going to make some calls. She understood because she had learned to hear what people didn't say, that some calls meant something significant. She did not let herself decide what. She said thank you. She meant it without performance. He heard the difference. He made 8 calls over the next 3 weeks. Not all of them worked. 2 universities cited intake limits that were technically accurate and practically convenient. One of his contacts in the engineering faculty at a respected institution told him that the application timeline had simply passed and there was nothing to be done for this academic year. He accepted that. He was patient in the way that people who have achieved things through sustained effort over a long period are patient. Not because they are not urgent, but because they know urgency without strategy is noise. The call that mattered was the 9th one. Professor Diane Atchison ran the aerospace engineering department at university he had supported through the foundation for 4 years. Not a Russell Group institution, which was what Amara had applied to, but a respected program with a specific strength in remote sensing and Earth observation that was he had realized after rereading the personal statement a 3rd time, almost exactly aligned with what she had described as her actual interest. He sent her the file. She read it on a Thursday. She called him on Friday morning. She said, *, get her to apply. I'll review it personally. *, he called Amara that same Friday afternoon. By this point, it had been 3 weeks since his first call. She had been cautious with her hope. She had cupped it carefully, the way you cup a match flame in wind, keeping it small so it could survive. She was still working at the stall. She was studying at night, not for any specific program, just studying the way she always had, because stopping felt like accepting something she hadn't agreed to accept. When he called with the news, she sat down on a crate of unsorted fabric, and she said nothing for a moment, and he waited, and she said, I have to rewrite the personal statement. He said, why? She said, because now I know more about remote sensing than I did when I wrote the first one. He laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh before. It was the laugh of a man who had not been surprised in a while, and found it pleasantly disorienting. She submitted the application within 10 days. The application itself was not the hard part. The hard part was the funding. The scholarship that had covered her secondary education at Harrington did not extend to university. She was not a UK domestic student. International student fees were a number that had no relationship to the reality of her family's finances. Her father drove a taxi. Her mother sold fabric. They would have given her everything they had without a moment's hesitation, and everything they had would not have covered the first term. The general knew this before she did. He had already begun the parallel process, the one that ran alongside the admissions process, and that she wouldn't know about until it was complete, because he had learned long ago that telling someone about help you're not yet certain you could deliver creates a debt of hope that compounds with cruelty if the help doesn't come through. He contacted 4 organizations. 2 responded meaningfully. 1, a private engineering and technology foundation with a specific mandate around African STEM talent, offered a partial bursary. The second, a Commonwealth scholarship body he had worked with for 3 years, reviewed her file and offered, pending her formal acceptance to the program, a full tuition scholarship with a modest living allowance. She did not know any of this was happening. She was waiting. She was waking up at 5 in the morning and working the early market with her mother and spending her afternoons reading papers on remote sensing technology she was downloading on her phone because the connection on her laptop at home was too slow, and she was going to show up to this program knowing things they hadn't taught her yet if she got in. When she got in, the conditional offer arrived on a Monday. Professor Atchison had written a 1-line note appended to the formal letter. It was not standard. It said, "I read your personal statement twice. See you in September." Amara read it standing in the fabric stall. Her mother was talking to a customer 3 feet away and didn't notice for a moment that her daughter had gone very still. Then she noticed. Amara turned around. She held up the phone. Her mother read it. Then she read it again. Then she did something Amara had not seen her do in years, maybe not since Amara was small. She left the customer, mid-sale, fabric still in hand, and she wrapped both arms around her daughter, and she didn't let go for a long time. The customer waited. She understood. Some things are more important than selling fabric. That evening, Amara sat down and wrote a letter. Long one, the kind that takes 2 hours and 3 attempts and ends up much shorter than you started because you cut everything that sounded like it was performing gratitude rather than expressing it. She wrote to the general. She told him about the morning she had read the rejection email. She told him she had not cried. She told him she had worn the yellow dress home and what the yellow dress meant to her mother and what had meant to her in the airport when it meant something different. She told him she didn't know how to account for what he had done, not because there were no words, but because the words she had didn't feel proportionate. She asked him one question at the end. She asked why. His reply came 3 days later. It was not long. He said he had read a paragraph she had written about a drought she watched a documentary about when she was 14. He said he had been in the Army for 31 years, and the most important thing he had learned was the difference between people who see a problem and feel bad about it, and people who see a problem and start calculating how to fix it. He said her paragraph was the second kind. He said, "The system, close your file. That was a mistake. I fixed it. That's all." She read that last line 4 times. That's all. Like it was nothing. Like anyone would have done it. Like the 8 calls and the 3 weeks and the navigating of bureaucracy and the building of bridges between institutions and the parallel funding track he had run quietly, so she wouldn't know until it was safe to know. Like all of it was just the minimum reasonable response to a file that should not have been closed. She thought about that sentence for a long time. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone with power decides to use it for the right thing. She thought, I'm going to remember this when I have power. She didn't know yet how precisely she was going to keep that promise. She was going to university in September. She had a lot of work to do first. University was not what she had expected. It was harder than she expected and better than she expected and lonelier in the early weeks than she had allowed herself to predict because she had been so focused on getting there that she had not prepared herself for the experience of arriving somewhere you have worked your entire life to reach and realizing that the working was the part that made sense and the being there's something different, something that requires a different kind of effort than the one you trained for. The program was 3 years of aerospace engineering with a specialism pathway in remote sensing and Earth observation. The department was smaller than Manchester's would have been. This turned out to be an advantage. The faculty knew who she was within the first month. Not because she sought attention, but because she asked questions in lectures that made other students quietly open their laptops and start researching, and because her lab work was the kind that makes supervisors pause and look again. Professor Atchison taught 2 of her core modules. She was a compact, precise woman in her 50s who ran a research group on atmospheric monitoring systems and who had the specific quality of academic that treats students as unfinished colleagues rather than recipients of knowledge. She did not make Amara feel special. She made Amara feel expected to perform. This was better. Being made to feel special requires maintenance. Being held to a high standard is just work, and Amara knew how to do work. The first year was calibration. She was closing gaps she didn't know she had. Areas where the secondary education she had received, good as Harrington was, had not prepared her for the depth of the university program. She did not resent the gaps. She mapped them. She addressed them. She spent Saturday mornings in the library with a level of deliberateness that her course mates, who were also working hard, still managed to find mildly humbling. She was not competing with them. She was competing with the version of herself that the rejection email had almost persuaded her to become. She made friends slowly. Not because she was closed to people, she was warm in the direct way her mother had modeled, the way that doesn't waste time on social performance, but because she had learned somewhere along the way to be careful with her trust, and careful with her hope, and careful with the people she allowed to matter to her. She had a small circle that meant more than a large one. There was Marcus, a Scottish student from Dundee who had come to engineering after spending 2 years as a mechanic, and who had a mechanical intuition that was almost offensive. He could look at a schematic and feel where the problem was the way some people feel music. There was Preeti, who was studying the same specialism and who had come from a research family in Bangalore and who communicated primarily in data and terrible puns, and who made Amara laugh more than she had expected to be laughing in the first year of a rigorous engineering program. She wrote to the General Monthly. Not because he had asked her to, because it seemed right, because she was in the middle of something he had made possible and he deserved to know how it was going. Not the polished version, but the real version, the one with the gaps and the recalibrations and the Saturday library mornings and the growing understanding of exactly what she had gotten herself into. He wrote back, shorter replies than hers, more direct. He asked questions, not the general how is it going questions, but the specific kind that made her think. He asked what she thought about the gap between what remote sensing technology could do and what African governments were actually deploying. He asked who in the field she had found whose thinking she respected. He asked what she was reading outside the curriculum. These questions were not mentorship in the soft guidance session sense. They were more like a recurring test he was running on whether she was still the person he had thought she was when he read the file. She understood this. She found it useful. It kept her thinking past the boundaries of the program. In her second year, Professor Atchison invited her to join the margins of a research project the department was running with a consortium of West African meteorological agencies. It was an early-stage project, not the kind that generates publications yet, more the kind where you are building the methodology and identifying the problems before you identify the solutions. The project was about improving early warning systems for extreme weather events in the Sahel, specifically about the gap between what satellite data could predict and what local agencies had the infrastructure to receive and act on. Amara sat in the first project meeting and looked at the slide deck and recognized the problem. Not abstractly, not intellectually. She recognized it the way you recognize someone you have met before. She had been 14. She had watched a documentary. She had understood, with the mathematical part of her brain, that the problem was partly an engineering problem. She had not known then what to call the field. She knew now. She contributed to that meeting in a way that made the project lead, a researcher named Dr. Fayafi Mensah, who was based in Accra and was attending by video call, stopped mid-sentence and asked her to say that again. She said it again. He wrote something down. After the meeting, he asked Professor Atchison about her. Atchison told him she was a second-year undergrad. He said he didn't believe her. Over the next year, Amara worked on the edges of that project around her coursework, contributing analysis, writing small sections of the methodology documentation, attending every meeting she was invited to, and a few she invited herself to. She was not being paid. It was not for credit in any formal sense. She did it because it was the problem she had identified at 14, and she was finally in a room where the problem was being worked on, and she was not going to be on the outside of that room. In her third year, she wrote her dissertation on predictive modeling for agricultural drought in sub-Saharan Africa using multi-source satellite data. Her supervisor told her, in the way that academics tell you important things in the understated British Institutional Register, that means the exact opposite of casual, that this was a dissertation that deserved to be read more widely. She graduated with first-class honors. Professor Atchison shook her hand at the ceremony with both hands. The double grip, the kind that means something. That evening she called her mother. Her father answered instead because her mother was on the other phone already telling someone and couldn't get off. Her father said, in a voice that was doing significant work to remain steady, that he had driven his taxi that morning and told 3 passengers that his daughter was graduating from university in England with a first-class degree in aerospace engineering, and that all 3 of them had said congratulations, and he had said yes. She called the general after. He said, "Asterisk good. Now the harder part." "Asterisk," she said. "I know. The harder part was the career." She had offers. The graduation and the dissertation and the profile she had developed through the research project had generated more visibility than she had expected. One of the offers was from a satellite technology company in Luxembourg. Clean work. Good salary by any measure that mattered to the taxi driver's daughter. The kind of employment that would have satisfied every practical adult in her life who had worried about whether the path she was on would lead somewhere stable. She turned it down. She took a position instead with a regional environmental monitoring agency in West Africa, specifically a joint initiative between 3 governments, including Ghana's, that was trying to build internal technical capacity for satellite data processing. The salary was a fraction of a Luxembourg offer. The infrastructure was inconsistent. The bureaucracy was the kind that operates at a pace that makes people who are used to European institutions feel mildly ill. She had been warned about all of this by people who cared about her. She went anyway, because the problem was there, because the capacity gap she had read about at 14 and studied for 3 years and contributed to research on was a real gap that would remain real until there were people with the specific technical knowledge to close it. And she was now one of those people. And if she took herself to Luxembourg then, she was taking that capacity out of the place it was most needed. She had thought about that last line in the general's letter a lot over the years. The system closed your file. That was a mistake. I fixed it. That's all. Asterisk, she thought about it differently now than she had in the fabric stall in Accra. What she understood now, having worked inside institutions, having seen how they made decisions about who to invest in and who to process and file away, was that it was not all. It was not a small thing or a simple thing. It required someone with the access and the willingness and the specific discipline of using both for something other than their own advancement. It required someone who had built power carefully enough that they could spend some of it on a person they had never met, based on 2 pages of evidence, without needing a return on the investment. And it required the belief, the foundational belief that the general had clearly decided to operate from, that the greatest waste in any system is not money or time or resources. It is human potential that gets bureaucratically filed away because the process designed to identify it was built by people who couldn't see all the shapes it comes in. She worked at the agency for 2 years. In that time, the monitoring network, she helped to build processed early warning data that contributed to 3 emergency response protocols during flood and drought events across the region. The data wasn't hers alone. It never is this kind of work, but she was part of the infrastructure that made it available to the people who needed it. In her 3rd year, she was recruited onto the Joint Technical Committee of a Pan-African Space Initiative. She was 28 years old. She was the youngest person on the committee by 9 years. She was one of 2 women. She did not adjust her voice or her thinking to make either of those facts more comfortable for anyone in the room. She gave a briefing to the Committee on Capacity Gaps in Satellite Monitoring Infrastructure across member states. The briefing was dense. It was specific. It was the opposite of a prepared-to-impress document, and exactly a prepared-to-be-useful one, and the distinction was visible in every line of it. The committee chair, a Nigerian diplomat who had spent 30 years watching technical briefings, said afterward that it was the clearest analysis of the capacity problem he had read. She went home that evening and sat on the floor of her apartment in Accra. A small apartment, second floor, the ceiling fan slightly unreliable, the view out the window the same city that had raised her, and she thought about the fabric stall and the yellow dress and the international prefix on an unknown number on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about the paperclip on her page. She thought about what it means for someone to look at a closed file and decide, without being asked, without a mandate, without any particular personal stake in the outcome, that the closure was wrong. She thought about the students who didn't have a general, the files that stayed closed, the people who went home in yellow dresses and didn't get the phone call and eventually stopped expecting it and found other lives and sometimes found good ones and sometimes didn't. And in both cases, carry the closed file the way you carry something that was taken from you before you understood the full weight of what it was. She started writing the proposal that night. It took 4 months to complete. It was a proposal for a scholarship and advocacy program, rooted in the Commonwealth Education Access Initiative's existing framework, but expanded in scope, specifically designed to identify engineering and STEM students from sub-Saharan Africa whose academic trajectories had been interrupted at the university admission stage by structural barriers rather than merit deficits. She sent it to the general. He read it in 2 days. He called her on the third. He said it was good. He asked 14 specific questions. She answered 11 immediately and told him the other 3 required more research. He said correct. She said she knew he had done this before and that she was not asking him to hand her his organization. She was asking if he would help her build something that could work in parallel, something that had her specific experience of the structural failures embedded in its design in a way that his version, built from the outside, couldn't fully have. He was quiet for a moment. The good quiet. The thinking one. He said, "Send me the budget projections." She did. The program launched 14 months later. In its first year, it identified 11 students across Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, and Kenya whose university applications had been rejected despite exceptional academic records. Of those 11, 9 were successfully placed in appropriate programs with full funding secured. 2 cases were still in negotiation at year's end, with placement expected in the following intake. She told the general about all 11. He read every update. She called him on the anniversary of the first phone call he had made to her. She wasn't sure he would remember the date. He did. She said she wanted him to know something. He said, "Go ahead." She said, "Asterisk, you called me, and you asked if I still wanted to study aerospace engineering. And I said yes. One word. And I didn't explain it. Asterisk," he said. "I remember." She said, "Asterisk what I wanted to say, but didn't was that I had been studying for 3 months since the rejection. Not for any program. Just studying. Because stopping felt like agreeing to something I hadn't agreed to." Asterisk, he said nothing. Waited. She said, "Asterisk, I want you to know that. I want you to know that you didn't save me from stopping. I wasn't going to stop, but you gave me somewhere to go. And that is a different thing. That is the thing I'm trying to give to 11 other people this year." Asterisk, he said, "That's exactly what it is." She said, "Asterisk, I know. I learned it from you." Asterisk, he was quiet again. She had come to understand his quiet by now. She knew the difference between his thinking quiet and his moved quiet. This was the second kind. He said, "Your mother still sell fabric?" She laughed. Said yes. Her mother still sold fabric and was better at it than ever and had 3 people working for her now and had told Amara last week that she was very proud, but that she hoped Amara was not working so hard that she was forgetting to eat. He said, "Listen to your mother." She said she would try. She hung up. She went back to her desk. There were 12 new files in her inbox. Students. Names she didn't know yet. Transcripts and personal statements and rejection letters and teacher notes written in careful, urgent language by educators who had seen something worth fighting for and didn't know what else to do with that belief except send it somewhere and hope someone was paying attention. She opened the first file. She read it the way she had been taught to read things. For the detail that didn't seem important until it was. For the student who had done everything right. For the person who would run the moment someone opened the door. She found a paragraph near the end that she read twice. She reached for a paper clip. She put on the page. She picked up her phone. Call her, asterisk,